I was reviewing an old appraisal file I had no particular reason to reread that afternoon. An old habit from decades spent working as a certified antiques appraiser, when a formal letter arrived from my own professional certification board, informing me that a routine audit of my practice's own recent appraisal records had identified multiple high value appraisals issued over the past year without the required independent second opinion review. Our own accreditation specifically mandated for any item valued above a certain threshold. I remember setting that letter down slowly, my own reading glasses still perched on my nose, right before its contents rearranged the entire shape of that afternoon. I had no idea that my daughter-in-law, managing daily operations at my own appraisal practice, had been quietly skipping that required second opinion review on dozens of high-value appraisals over the past year to move client work along more quickly, risking my own decades-earned professional accreditation entirely. And that, within the following week, I would personally contact the board directly, taking full responsibility for the lapse while formally halting every single unreviewed appraisal until proper review could actually occur. My name is Bernadette Beckwith. I'm 77 years old. I spent decades working as a certified antiques appraiser, the kind of career that teaches you that a professional certification's own specific requirements exist precisely to protect clients who genuinely cannot verify an appraisal's own accuracy themselves, and teaches you, too, that handing someone daily operational authority is an entirely different thing from handing them the authority to decide which required professional standards actually still apply. My husband Rodrigo died 7 years ago, a sudden heart attack while restoring an antique clock at his own workbench late one evening, the kind of careful, patient work that gave no warning at all. I remember finding him there, his own tools still spread carefully around the clock's own open casing. Grief that arrives in the middle of the work you both loved teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the sound of a clock's own ticking can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn slowly to keep working with careful, patient things anyway, because the alternative is letting an entire professional life standard go untended. I earned my own professional certification decades ago after years of rigorous training and examination, and built a genuinely respected practice specifically known for scrupulous accuracy, particularly on higher value items where our own accrediting board specifically required an independent second appraiser's own confirming review before any final valuation could actually be issued to a client. That requirement, and my own decades of scrupulous compliance with it, remained the single most important protection of my practice's own professional integrity throughout my entire career. After Rodrigo died, protecting that standard's own careful, continued observance, exactly the way I always had, became something closer to sacred to me, the clearest remaining trace of decades spent building something meaningful, in some part, alongside him. Rodrigo and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as a furniture restorer for nearly 40 years, meticulous with every joint and every finish. The kind of man who could tell you the exact decade a chair had actually been built simply by examining how its own joints had been cut. When I told him, 3 years into our marriage, that I wanted to pursue formal appraisal training rather than continue only helping catalog pieces in his own workshop, he didn't tell me it would be difficult with a young family at home. He told me he'd handle every school pickup and every dinner on my longest study nights, and he did for years without complaint. I built my own career slowly after that, the way most honest expertise gets built, one carefully documented appraisal at a time, decades in the profession, until I finally retired with more patience than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one particular young appraiser early in my own career, a woman convinced she'd never developed the confidence to flag a piece she genuinely suspected was a skillful reproduction rather than the genuine article A client desperately wanted it to be, whom I spent an entire year quietly mentoring after our shared examinations, never once mentioning to the firm's partners how much extra time it actually required. She went on to run her own respected appraisal practice for over 2 decades, and years later, a letter arrived thanking me for refusing to let her give up on her own instincts. I think about that letter often now, in a different light than I once did. Understanding that quiet, uncredited mentorship had always been the actual substance of my working life, long before I ever imagined needing that same careful instinct applied to protecting my own family's professional standing. I have 2 children. Cosette, my daughter, is a museum registrar herself, 3 time zones away, precise and exacting in exactly the way you'd hope a registrar's judgment would be. She calls every Sunday evening without fail, a habit that started the year Roderigo died and never once lapsed since. My son Talmadge is 46, works in estate liquidation himself, married for 9 years to a woman named Tamsin Everhart, 38, whose growing role managing the practice's daily operations he has supported personally since they met, and who has always had a particular gift for making a significant procedural shortcut sound like simple operational efficiency. Tamsin grew up in a family that valued moving through client work quickly, considerably more than protecting a specific procedural safeguard's own careful, continuous observance. The kind of household where a satisfied client was considered proof enough that a process had worked properly, regardless of whether every actual required step had genuinely been followed. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's instinct toward efficient client service comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep accepting that instinct indefinitely, especially once it starts quietly bypassing a standard specifically built to protect against exactly that kind of shortcut. She told me a story once early in her relationship with Talmadge, back when we still spoke easily and often about her own father's small home inspection business, how he used to skip certain inspection steps on properties that looked obviously fine to his own experienced eye, believing that decades of instinct made the formal checklist redundant for anyone genuinely skilled enough. My dad always said the checklist was for beginners, she told me. I grew up believing that real expertise eventually earned you the right to trust your own judgment over a formal process built for people who hadn't developed that judgment yet. I remember thinking at the time that it reflected a genuinely confident, experienced approach to a demanding trade. I didn't yet understand that she had absorbed an entire framework built around treating required safeguards as training wheels rather than genuine protection, and that a certification requirement built specifically because even the most experienced appraiser can occasionally miss something would eventually become the thing that framework was applied to without my consent. About a year ago, as I found myself increasingly overwhelmed managing the practice's own growing client demand alone, Tamsin offered to help, given her own genuine organizational skill and her enthusiasm for the practice's own continued success. I welcomed her help gratefully at first, genuinely relieved to have someone capable managing details I found increasingly difficult to keep up with alone. I did make clear early on that the practice's own required second opinion review on any high-value appraisal was strictly non-negotiable given how deliberately our own accrediting board had built that specific safeguard into the certification itself. She told me she understood completely. It would take nearly a year of careful, escalating deviation before I understood exactly how much that understanding had actually meant. For the first several months, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Tamsin's own genuine organizational skill helping the practice run considerably more smoothly. The required second opinion review remaining fully intact on every high-value item. The first time I noticed something beginning to shift was about 4 months in, when Tamsin mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd started occasionally proceeding with a final appraisal report before the second reviewer had actually completed their own sign-off, framing the practice as simply helpful efficiency rather than a departure from the specific required sequence our own accreditation actually mandated. The second incident happened when I discovered, entirely by accident, reviewing the practice's own recent files out of habit, that a significant appraisal, well above the threshold requiring second review, had been issued to a client with only my own original signature on file. No second reviewer's confirmation anywhere in the actual record at all. The third incident happened when Talmadge mentioned to me, during an ordinary visit, that Tamsin had been handling considerably more of the practice's own client-facing work lately, though he admitted a little sheepishly that he hadn't followed the specific internal review process closely himself. The fourth incident happened when I overheard Tamsin on a phone call with a client, discussing a final appraised value in language that made clear the report itself was already finalized and ready for delivery, at a point considerably earlier than any actual second opinion review could reasonably have already occurred. The fifth incident happened during an ordinary dinner when Tamsin mentioned, brightly, that she'd managed to cut the practice's own average turnaround time nearly in half, framing the achievement itself as an impressive operational improvement, rather than something I'd had any real opportunity to evaluate against what that faster turnaround might actually be skipping. "Bernadette, isn't that wonderful?" she said, glancing at me with genuine, apparently unguarded enthusiasm. "Clients are so much happier getting their reports back this quickly." I sat there listening to my daughter-in-law describe bypassing a specific, required professional safeguard as straightforward operational success, as though decades of my own scrupulous, deliberate compliance with our own accreditation's actual requirements were an inconvenient bureaucratic delay rather than the very protection my practice's entire professional credibility actually depended upon. The sixth incident happened when Tamsin's own mother, meeting me at a family gathering, mentioned how impressed she was watching her daughter run the practice with such natural efficiency. "She's always had that gift," she said, beaming, "for cutting through unnecessary red tape and just getting things done for people." I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else directly, though I remember driving home afterward feeling the particular unease of understanding that a genuinely serious professional violation was being publicly celebrated as simple efficiency. The seventh incident is the one I think about most, because it's the one where I should have said something more directly and didn't. It happened when Tamsin mentioned, casually, that she'd started keeping a small internal note explaining that second opinion reviews would follow later for particularly busy weeks. A description that made the actual practice of issuing final, signed appraisals before the required review had genuinely occurred sound like simple administrative sequencing rather than something that fundamentally violated the specific certification requirement our entire practice's professional standing actually depended upon. The eighth incident happened when I overheard Tamsin describing the practice's own turnaround time to a colleague visiting the house as basically her own personal achievement now, language that suggested she'd stopped connecting that speed to the specific safeguard being quietly skipped in order to actually produce it. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment something feels wrong. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Tamsin is just being efficient the way capable people are. Talmadge loves me even if he doesn't ask more questions about his own wife's process. Clients seem satisfied enough, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others because believing them was easier than accepting that a genuinely serious professional violation had been quietly building for months, disguised as simple operational improvement. There was one afternoon, about a month before everything finally came to a head, when I came close to addressing this more directly. Tamsin mentioned, during an ordinary conversation, that she'd fully caught up on all the pending second opinion reviews, and that everything was current now, framing the update itself as reassuring rather than something that implicitly confirmed a genuine backlog had actually existed at all. I sat with that comment for a long moment, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying, out loud, exactly how uncomfortable this entire situation had made me. Then I thought about Talmadge's own happiness, about how much he valued his wife's operational initiative, about how a direct confrontation might feel like an attack on something he was genuinely proud of her for handling. I let the comment pass and told myself one more time that the moment to address this fully hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came the letter from the certification board. I opened that formal notice at my own kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening, informing me plainly that a routine audit of my practice's own recent records had identified multiple high-value appraisals issued without the required second opinion review, and that the board would need a complete accounting of every affected file, along with an explanation of exactly how this pattern had occurred, before my own accreditation's continued standing could actually be confirmed. I sat with that letter for a long time, understanding with total clarity exactly how close decades of scrupulous professional compliance had come to genuine serious jeopardy because of a shortcut I had never actually authorized and had only partially understood was even happening. I called Talmadge immediately. "Talmadge," I said, "I need you and Tamsin here tonight. I just received a formal notice from the certification board. Multiple appraisals were apparently issued without the required second review, and my own accreditation is now genuinely at risk." When they arrived, I set the letter on my own kitchen table between us. "This is what's actually been happening," I said, my voice calmer than I expected it to be. Every single violation this letter describes traces directly back to appraisals finalized before the required second opinion review ever actually occurred. Exactly the specific practice I explicitly told Tamsin from the very beginning was strictly non-negotiable. Tamsin's face went pale. I thought getting reports back to clients faster mattered more than waiting on a review that almost always confirmed the original valuation anyway, she admitted, her voice barely steady. "I didn't realize skipping it, even temporarily, could actually put your entire accreditation at risk. It could, and it did," I told her. "And now this family's entire professional standing, decades of my own scrupulous work, is genuinely at risk because of a shortcut made without proper authorization." I called my old friend Della before I called the board directly, a woman I'd worked alongside for over 2 decades in the same regional appraisers association, needing to hear a voice that understood exactly how seriously a certification's own specific requirements actually needed to be honored. I told her the whole story, nearly a year of gradual deviation, the board's own formal letter, my own genuine alarm at what it actually revealed. She listened without interrupting, her own coffee going cold in front of her. "Bernadette," she finally said, "you spent decades teaching younger appraisers in our own association exactly why every single required safeguard exists, specifically to protect clients who have no other way to verify an appraisal's own accuracy. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the person who bypassed it happens to be family herself. I keep waiting to feel like I'm overreacting to some paperwork sequencing," I told her, "and it isn't coming." "Maybe it isn't coming," Della said, "because you're not overreacting. Multiple high-value appraisals were issued without a specifically required safeguard, and you only found out because the board happened to conduct a routine audit. That's not an overreaction. That's exactly the alarm that situation actually required. I contacted the certification board's own compliance officer directly the following morning, a sharp, longtime professional acquaintance named Rosalind Blackstone, whom I'd worked with for years on various matters related to my own original certification. I explained the situation plainly, taking full personal responsibility as the practice's own certified appraiser of record, and requested guidance on exactly how to proceed with a complete, independent review of every affected file. "Bernadette," she said, after reviewing the situation herself, "the board genuinely appreciates your own immediate, transparent cooperation here. Given your own decades of otherwise scrupulous compliance, a full independent re-review of every affected appraisal, conducted at your own expense and completed within a defined time frame, will likely allow your accreditation to remain intact, provided the actual pattern doesn't continue going forward. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do because I think it matters. I did not attempt to minimize the violation or shift responsibility away from myself as the practice's own certified professional of record. I formally halted every single unreviewed appraisal from being relied upon by any client until proper second opinion review could actually be completed. Personally contacted every affected client to explain the situation honestly, and committed the practice to a considerably more rigorous internal verification process going forward. Talmadge called me the following morning, his voice tight with genuine fear rather than his usual calm. "Mom, could you actually lose your certification over this?" "It's a real possibility if we don't handle this exactly right," I said calmly. "The board has confirmed that immediate, complete cooperation and a full independent review should allow the accreditation to remain intact. But this family's entire professional standing was put at serious risk because a required safeguard was quietly skipped without proper authorization. And I need everyone to understand exactly how serious that actually was." "I had no idea it had gotten this far," he said quietly. "I trusted Tamsin's own operational judgment and never asked enough questions about the actual certification requirements myself." That trust wasn't unreasonable, I told him, but a decision this significant, one that actually risked our entire professional standing, needed considerably more scrutiny than either of us gave it. Tamsin came to see me alone 2 days later, considerably more subdued than I'd ever seen her, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. I didn't understand how seriously the actual second opinion requirement was meant to be honored, she admitted, her voice barely steady. I thought of it as sort of a formality that mattered less than actually getting clients their answers quickly. It was never simply a formality, I told her. It's the specific safeguard our entire accreditation depends on, built precisely to catch the rare mistake a single appraiser might genuinely miss. Skipping it, even with good intentions, nearly cost this family decades of professional credibility. "I know that now," she said, her eyes filling. I don't know how I convinced myself that speed and genuine accuracy were the same thing. I considered her admission for a long moment before responding. "They are not remotely the same thing, Tamsin, and the gap between them nearly cost this entire family its professional standing." Given Tamsin's full cooperation in the review process and her genuine willingness to understand exactly what had gone wrong, Della, Rosalind, and I completed an independent re-review of every single affected appraisal over the following 3 months, ultimately confirming that the original valuations had, in fact, been accurate in nearly every case, though 2 required meaningful correction. Corrections we disclosed honestly and promptly to the affected clients. The weeks that followed were still difficult ones, even after the review process began. Talmadge struggled visibly with understanding how close his own family's professional standing had come to genuine, lasting damage without his full awareness. Cosette, once she heard the whole story, offered to help with the actual re-review process herself, bringing her own museum registrar's expertise to help make certain every single file was actually addressed properly rather than simply patched over quickly. About 3 weeks after the review began, Talmage came to see me alone, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about watching Dad restore that clock, checking and rechecking every single mechanism before he ever trusted it to keep accurate time again, he said. I don't know when I started assuming the second review requirement was just paperwork rather than the actual thing protecting this practice's entire credibility. Thank you for saying that now, I told him. Why didn't you ask more questions sooner, before it went this far? Because I trusted Tamsin's operational instincts more than I questioned the actual certification specifics, he said. I think I forgot that trusting someone's general competence and verifying a legally binding professional requirement aren't the same thing. Tamsin and I talked at length several more times over the following weeks, working through not just the practical review, but the deeper misunderstanding that had allowed things to progress as far as they had. I keep thinking about how close I came to actually costing this family decades of your own professional reputation, she admitted during one of those later conversations. I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Bernadette, but some part of this was just about genuinely wanting to prove I could make the practice run more efficiently. That desire is entirely understandable, I told her gently. I never doubted your genuine organizational talent. I only ever wanted a decision this significant to receive the same careful scrutiny any properly accredited practice actually requires. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. I've been thinking about everything, she admitted, about how easily wanting to prove my own competence turned into believing speed mattered more than the specific safeguard that speed was actually bypassing. I think I convinced myself that satisfied clients meant the process itself didn't really matter, without ever separating those two very different questions properly. You were never entitled to bypass a required professional safeguard, Tamsin, I told her, but you were always entitled to bring your own genuine efficiency ideas to me directly to see what might actually be possible within our real accreditation requirements. Those are very different paths, and only one of them was ever actually available to you. I don't know how to undo how close I came to costing this family everything, she said. You don't undo a near miss, I told her. You account for it honestly, which you have, and then you spend considerable time afterward proving, through small, consistent carefulness, that you understand exactly why that scrutiny mattered as much as it did. We talked for nearly 2 hours that particular afternoon about Rodrigo, about the workshop, about what genuine professional integrity actually required. I showed her decades of my own original appraisal files, the careful, patient documentation Rodrigo and I used to discuss together before anything ever left our own practice. Tamsin looked through those files slowly, her hands careful, before asking if she could help me develop a clear, written verification protocol that made certain genuine review time was actually protected, even during genuinely busy weeks. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Talmadge and Tamsin began attending a small professional ethics workshop together that autumn, specifically to better understand how accreditation standards actually functioned to protect clients, not simply as bureaucratic requirements to be managed around. Tamsin told me later that the instructor had used almost the exact language Rosalind had used with our own situation, describing exactly the kind of procedural shortcut Tamsin had nearly normalized as one of the most common, serious risks facing small, family-run professional practices specifically. I called Della a few weeks after the review concluded to update her on how everything had actually unfolded. Bernadette, I've handled a lot of these accreditation matters over the years, she told me. And I can tell you, your response was remarkably fast and genuinely restorative, given how serious the actual violation was. Most professionals understandably become defensive or minimize something like this once they realize what happened. You moved this family straight toward genuine accountability and repair. Cosette flew in for the holiday gathering that year, the first time in years that both of my children had gathered under one roof at once. My own dining room filled with the smell of a roast and the sound of easy conversation that hadn't existed at any family gathering in longer than I cared to admit. Talmadge and Tamsin drove over with a pie Tamsin had made herself. No elaborate presentation, just a slightly uneven crust. She laughed about setting down on my counter. Over dinner, Cosette's husband Barclay asked, carefully, how the whole situation had eventually settled, having heard only fragments of the story secondhand. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in this family, before Tamsin simply said, I let wanting to prove my own efficiency turn into something that genuinely risked this family's entire professional credibility. Bernadette handled it with more grace than I honestly deserved. We're doing this properly now, together. Nobody laughed uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Barclay, genuinely curious rather than unkind, asked Tamsin how it had felt, realizing how close the accreditation had come to actually being lost. Tamsin was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. Humbling isn't a strong enough word, she said. I think I finally understood what it costs an entire family when you let confidence replace an honest respect for the safeguards that actually protect everyone, including yourself. I appreciated that she didn't try to soften the admission for the sake of a pleasant holiday table. Tamsin called her own father that same autumn, correcting at last the way she'd absorbed his particular philosophy about experienced instinct making formal checklists redundant. Talmadge told me she'd come off the phone looking wrung out, describing her father's reaction as a long, uncomfortable silence, followed by a quiet admission that he'd never actually stopped to consider how many small, invisible mistakes his own confident shortcuts might have genuinely allowed to slip through undetected over the years. She sent me a brief note not long after, considerably more restrained than Talmadge's or Tamsin's own, but genuine in its own careful way, thanking me for correcting a philosophy about experience and safeguards she'd apparently absorbed without ever fully examining its actual risk. A few weeks after that gathering, a card arrived in my mailbox, Talmadge's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written considerably more than a few lines. Mom, I keep thinking about all the months I let Tamsin's efficiency go unquestioned instead of taking your own discomfort seriously the first time you mentioned it. I can't undo that, but I can promise to actually listen the moment you tell me something feels wrong from now on. Thank you for handling something this serious with more patience than I think I would have managed myself. Tucked inside the same envelope was a smaller note in Tamsin's own handwriting, brief and considerably more humble than anything she'd ever said to me directly. Bernadette, I let practicality turn into something genuinely careless with your own decades of professional credibility, and I'm still working to understand fully what that could have cost you permanently. Thank you for handling it in a way that gave me the chance to actually make it right instead of simply losing your trust. I folded both notes carefully and placed them in a small drawer beside Roderigo's own original workbench tools, a small, permanent record of exactly how seriously that professional standard had always needed to be protected. I saw Della again that spring, over coffee at the same small cafe where we'd talked through everything the week that letter first arrived. I told her about the review, the workshop, the honest notes. Della listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. I told you it would matter, catching that discrepancy the moment you understood it, she said. Most people don't take something like that seriously enough, even when their own instincts are practically shouting at them. You did, and look what it actually protected, not just the accreditation, the whole practice's honesty going forward. I thought about that phrase for days afterward, understanding that it described exactly what had actually been at stake the whole time. Do you regret any of it? Della asked gently, reporting it as formally as you did. I don't regret any of it, I told her. I regret that it took an actual board audit for any of us to have an honest conversation about what that certification requirement actually protected. I think I needed that alarm in some strange way to finally understand exactly what my own careful, decades long practice had been protecting all along. I think about that ordinary Tuesday evening often, my own reading glasses still resting on an old appraisal file, a formal letter revealing exactly how close decades of scrupulous professional standing had come to genuine, serious jeopardy. At the moment, it felt like the beginning of something frightening. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something considerably more honest. A family finally required to reckon directly with an assumption it had been quietly acting on instead of naming. I don't regret establishing that practice the way I did decades ago. Protecting my own genuine professional integrity mattered to me then, and it still does now. What I regret is how long I allowed the small, uncomfortable signs of shortcuts to go unaddressed before I finally insisted the record reflect what our own accreditation actually required. Real professional integrity was never meant to require quiet approximation to protect, and I intend to make certain every single required safeguard remains genuinely honored through an honest process for as long as I'm able to practice at all. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet discomfort was something to simply manage privately rather than something requiring a firm, immediate response. I no longer believe that. Tolerating small encroachments in silence isn't patience, it's simply a slower, quieter kind of vulnerability. And it costs exactly as much in the end, whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how much damage accumulates before you finally do. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The occasional proceeding without waiting for full review. The significant appraisal issued with only my own signature on file. The internal note explaining reviews would follow later. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent. A pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believe, looking back, that the eventual board audit revealed an isolated lapse rather than the culmination of nearly a year of careful, escalating shortcuts. Real protection of a professional standard's own actual integrity, I've come to believe, depends entirely on treating your own required safeguards with the same seriousness you'd want anyone else to treat them with. Refusing to let anyone reframe a genuine requirement as casual oversight simply because reframing it feels more convenient in the moment. If a family member needs you to treat your own considered professional standards as endlessly revisable based on their own preferences, that discomfort is telling you something important and it deserves an immediate, direct response, not a patient wait and see approach. I think of it now the way I used to think about a young appraiser genuinely convinced that her own confident first impression made a second opinion feel unnecessary. You can trust your own instinct if you want to. It's never actually a substitute for the specific, required verification that protects everyone, including yourself, from a mistake you genuinely can't see on your own. I think sometimes about all those years examining objects for a living, learning that every honest appraisal depends on the actual required process being followed completely, not simply believing in your own good instincts. It took me 77 years and one very ordinary board audit to make absolutely certain that principle was actually being lived out in my own family's practice. I welcomed Tamsin's help freely, and I would welcome genuine help freely again. But I no longer accept quiet approximation of a required standard as simply the price of keeping a practice running efficiently. If I am the one whose name carries this certification, I intend to remain the one whose actual practice honors every single requirement it demands, not because I distrust everyone who helps me, but because pretending my own compliance was ever optional was never actually true. The practice runs in full compliance now, exactly the way it always should have, Tamsin always building genuine review time into the schedule well in advance, rather than treating the required second opinion as something optional during busy weeks. Cosette flew in specially for one of the practice's own recent milestone reviews. Standing near my own desk with genuine warmth on her face, watching Tamsin ask a second reviewer detailed, careful questions about a particular high-value piece before finalizing anything further. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for the better part of a year. I am 77 years old, a widow, a retired certified antiques appraiser who never quite managed full retirement, a mother and grandmother who still shows up for the people she loves whenever she's needed. But I am no longer a woman who quietly trusts her own professional standing to remain protected simply because it should, without ever formally protecting that standard herself. That particular version of me stayed behind in an ordinary evening's mail, along with a formal letter that nobody in this family will ever quite forget having to fully account for. I opened that letter that evening as one woman, and I sat down at my own desk as another. And I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently. If, given the chance to go back to the day Tamsin first offered to help with the practice, knowing everything I know now, I tell them the truth. I would welcome that help again, exactly the same way, because her genuine desire to help the practice run well was never the mistake. The mistake was assuming that a general understanding alone would naturally protect something as specific and essential as a required professional safeguard. That decades of carefully built credibility with my own clients could survive on their own weight without anyone occasionally insisting my own actual compliance be honored directly. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the trust I extended. It would be the year of small corrections I let slide, corrections I mistook again and again for graciousness rather than what they actually were. A slow and quiet surrender of my own life's actual professional standard. Talmadge's own daughter asked me once, sitting beside me at my own desk during a visit, why I always waited for a second person to check my own work when I'd been doing this job for so long already. I told her honestly that being genuinely good at something didn't mean you'd never miss anything, and that the moment you started believing your own experience made checking unnecessary was exactly the moment something eventually slipped through. She asked if she could watch the next second opinion review happen, and I let her, walking her through exactly what the second appraiser was actually looking for, understanding that showing her the real discipline mattered considerably more than simply explaining the rule itself. My own grandchildren know the whole story now, each one told honestly, exactly what nearly happened to their own grandmother's actual professional standing, and exactly how that near miss was, eventually, properly corrected instead. I tell it every single time exactly the same way, unhurried and complete. Decades of careful, personal practice, the near-permanent surrender, the eventual honest correction, watching them absorb a history that finally belongs to everyone who actually understands what a genuine professional standard is meant to protect. These days, when anyone asks about the appraisals still issued under my own name every single week, they hear the whole story, decades of careful work, a near miss, nobody saw coming, and a family that learned, considerably more urgently than it should have needed to, exactly what genuine professional integrity actually requires. I'm simply, finally, exactly as certain of my own practice's protected standing as I always should have been.